This week on The Impact. A new chapter for the gray wolf in Washington. The federal government announcing plans to take wolves off the endangered species list, meaning states and tribes will take control of their future.
The department has been prepared for this. The timing is right for that handoff of the baton from the feds to the department.
Is wolf recovery already a success?
We're fully confident that this species will continue to recover, will continue to recolonize the western parts of the state.
The states don't have adequate regulatory mechanisms in place.
Or is it too soon to lift federal protection of wolves?
Within Washington, watching the state management move west, we have only had one pack established west of the Cascade Crest, and it's a question whether that pack even still exists.
Hear both sides of the debate. That's all coming up on The Impact.
From Olympia, an in-depth look at decisions at the state capitol and how they impact you. This is The Impact.
Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced the decision to remove gray wolves from the federal endangered species list. The agency argues that wolf populations have made a dramatic comeback, saying, quote, gray wolves are no longer in danger of extinction or at risk of becoming so in the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of the species range, end quote. Wolf management policies, specifically lethal removal of individual wolves or entire packs, remains a very contentious issue in Washington. Currently, the Federal Endangered Species Act covers wolves in the western two-thirds of the state, but not the eastern third, where the majority of known wolf packs live. Wolves in that area were federally delisted in 2011. The decision means that state and tribal wildlife management agencies will have full authority to set policies governing how wolf populations are managed throughout Washington. Despite the federal change, gray wolves are still listed as endangered by the state. Joining me now, Donny Martorello, wolf policy leader for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So what does this decision mean here in Washington state, the federal decision to delist wolves?
Well, it means in Washington, the eastern third of the state is federally delisted. The western two-thirds were federally listed as endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and the whole state is state listed as endangered. So what this means is that the western two-thirds of the state has now been, or will be, on January 4th, federally delisted under ESA, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife will be the management authority for the entire state under our 2011 Wolf Conservation Management Plan, except for those tribal lands.
So in terms of the practical implications, the fact that most of the wolf packs in Washington live in areas which were already delisted, the eastern part of the state, does this mean that policies such as lethal control, which are agreed on by the Wolf Advisory Group, will be more of an option in the western part of the state if wolves move out there?
It does. We have, at last count, 26 packs. 21 of those are in the eastern third of the state where it's been federally delisted. The remainder are in the western two-thirds. And while we haven't had that level of conflict in the western two-thirds of the state, this means that if that level of conflict does occur, that the Department of Fish and Wildlife will have the full breadth of our 2011 Wolf Conservation Management Plan for managing wolves, which in the wolf livestock world includes both non-lethal tools and lethal. So the lethal component of this becomes available if needed in that western two-thirds of the state. And I would just add that the department has been prepared for this. We have as I said, a Wolf Conservation Management Plan, which we've been operating under since 2011, and the timing is right for that handoff of the baton from the feds to the department.
So I want to pose the adversarial view here. There are critics who think this decision is not a good idea, including some of the member groups on the Wolf Advisory Board oppose delisting wolves federally. So this from Wolf Haven International, quote, if delisted, wolves throughout Washington will lose federal protections, which will allow for more lethal control under our current Washington Wolf Conservation and Management Plan. So, end quote. So do you think that's a bad thing? I mean, is that something that poses a threat to long-term recovery? And if not, why?
I don't. I totally understand the comment by Wolf Haven and by others, and there is concern there. Our 2011 Wolf Conservation Management Plan has the adequate protections to make sure this species recovers in the state of Washington, and we're well on that path with our first pack in 2008, now at 26 packs, and that recovery of wolves through natural recolonization has kind of started in the eastern part of the state and moving west. So with the protections that we have in place under the state listed status in our plan, we're fully confident that this species will continue to recover, will continue to recolonize the western parts of the state. I do want to acknowledge, though, that our Wolf Haven International and other organizations, yes, this does mean that the potential for lethal removal by the state is within the scope of our plan, but it's not something we just rush out and do. Our first line of defense for wolf livestock conflict is non-lethal tools to try to prevent the conflict from ever happening. It's a tool of last resort, and kind of knock on wood, we haven't had that in the western 2/3 of the state, but as wolves recolonize more and more of the state, there is a potential for that. So I would share with folks that the same diligence of wolf recovery that we've had in the eastern third will be the same that we have in the western 2/3. We'll keep moving forward to make sure this species is recovered, and the use of that lethal tool is kind of a last resort.
So opponents of this proposal have announced plans to challenge the federal delisting effort. What do you think about that, and does that impact how you move forward at this point? It
doesn't impact. Kind of suspect that may happen. Wolf conservation management is extremely controversial. That is we've seen that pattern of those legal challenges in other jurisdictions, so sort of expected it. But we're going to keep moving forward in terms of no surprises for anybody on whichever perspective they have. We're going to keep moving forward, working under the plan that I talked about, continue working with our stakeholders, our citizens of Washington, and all the communities that are out there, our elected officials in the legislature and in county government and everything in between, so that we're doing it together as we implement the Wolf Conservation Management Plan.
Okay, so just quickly on this other point here, again, critics of this proposal say it will greatly reduce the chances of wolves populating much of their former range in the North Cascades, Southwest Washington, and the Olympic Peninsula, which they argue would bolster the long-term recovery of the species. Do you disagree with that based on what we've seen in eastern Washington with the spread of wolves?
Respectfully, yes. I think that our past implementation of the plan is a good roadmap for what the future will look like in terms of every year we've seen an increasing wolf population. As the years go by, we see more and more wolves over more and more Washington. They have a stronghold in the eastern part of the state where we have had full management authority for many years. So I think we have a good track record in terms of progressing towards recovery. The other thing that I would add is that the use of the lethal removal, and a lot of times it jumps to this discussion, but the lethal removal of wolves when there is a pattern of wolf livestock conflict is just a part of wolf conservation and management. In that part of it, it's a tool that we look to when there's a number of things that we consider. Do we think that the pattern of conflict can be minimized with non-lethal tools first and foremost? Do we think it'll have an impact on the species recovery in the local area and throughout the state? And so if we have one of those situations where there's conflict, it's not in a stronghold of the state, and it's more in an area where it's the edge of wolves that are recolonizing other areas, we take that into deeper consideration. So just the fact that lethal removal may be a tool that's in the toolbox doesn't mean necessarily that it's something we're absolutely going to implement. There are many, many variables that we consider, and the impacts on recovery is number one on that list.
Now, the state's lethal removal policies have been controversial for years. That involves when wolves are killed for preying on livestock. Multiple times, those policies have been challenged in court. And earlier this year, Governor Jay Inslee actually directed the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission to come up with some new rules to essentially reduce the killing of wolves. Has anything come from that? And if so, what has been the response?
We are still in that process. The governor has directed the Fish and Wildlife Commission to conduct rulemaking on that topic. We're working with the Fish and Wildlife Commission now and charting that path for rulemaking. And so the goal there is to look at those areas where there is repeated kind of year in and year out of wolf livestock conflict. That's the loss of wolves and the loss of cows, and try to see if we can do something better. So we're in that process right now, working with the commission as directed by the governor.
And so fundamentally, one part of this conflict, you mentioned it's very contentious, it's controversial, there are frequent court challenges. You've got people, you've got ranchers, rural, way of life, and there's a conflict with the actual, at the biological level with the wolves, but you've also got this philosophical conflict from some people think that, a recovering species that was nearly wiped out in the state, a native species, should not be killed to protect privately owned livestock. And then you've also got people saying this is our way of life, this is our livelihood, we deserve to be protected. Will we ever get over that divide, do you think?
I think that we've begun to bridge that gap. And so you just touched on it there. I think you framed it well. There's a culture gap, and there are the needs of our diversity of our communities, and those that from that livestock industry's perspective and that way of life, and from the environmental perspective and the care for every individual wolf, we're bridging those cultures, those differences in needs. And I think our Washington citizens have already started doing that. I applaud the Wolf Advisory Group. They are folks that are from every corner of the state with very different perspectives. They've been able to come into the room and work on those guidelines for the department. And it's a challenge. It's a big issue. But they're working through that, and they're continuing to work through it. And so I think that's the right path to be on, is to empower our citizens to help guide us in implementing the plan and dealing with that very difficult issue.
All right, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Again, Wolf Policy Leader for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Donny Martorello. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
A coalition of environmental and wildlife conservation groups are backing a legal challenge of the move to delist gray wolves in the lower 48 states. That group includes the Lands Council, based in Spokane. Joining me now, Chris Bachman, Wildlife Program Director for the Lands Council. Your organization has publicly opposed the move to delist gray wolves. What is your argument?
Well, we believe that the delisting is politically motivated and not based in science. The gray wolf has not recovered throughout a significant portion of its range. Roughly 85% of its former range is still unoccupied. Significant portion of the range can be defined as major geographic areas. We don't have wolves in major geographic areas where they did exist and no longer exist. And what this ruling does has lumped existing core populations in with populations that currently don't exist for delisting. It's also violated Section 4 of overutilization. It doesn't take into account lethal management, it doesn't take into account recreational hunting, both by tribes and in the northern Rocky Mountain states. And we don't have adequate delisting or regulatory, the states don't have adequate regulatory mechanisms in place. Wolves are currently not listed as state endangered in Oregon, and the courts have ruled recently that the Washington Wolf Plan is not a binding document. So there really is no plan in place that is a binding rule.
So, devil's advocate here, the Wolf Management Agency in Washington State, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Wolf Advisory Group, which really helps sort of steer policy, might argue that the plan in place sort of balances needs of the rural ranchers and the rural way of life, while also trying to be careful not to reduce the growing population of wolves by any threshold that would actually prevent them from further recovering. And to their point, the population of wolves has expanded in Washington state from virtually 0 wolves in 2008 to now more than 130 wolves based on the count at the end of 2019 by the state and by tribes. Do you think that, and meanwhile, since 2013, at least the eastern half of the state has not had federal ESA protection. So do you think that it is a good argument to say that the wolves won't be able to spread into these other areas without the protection that they seem to be spreading without in eastern Washington?
Well, I think it's important. Yes, it is a plan. It's not a binding document, the wolf plan. Also, the wolf management, the lethal management document that you're referring to, I believe, is not codified. So it's not a rule. It's a reference document. It's not policy. And as far as, I think your numbers are a little bit off because WDFW no longer counts wolves on the Colville Reservation. They're not within their management purview. So the number as of the end of 2019 was 108 wolves and 21 packs, which is a little lower than the 130. So the wolves that are being managed by the tribe are no longer counted as state-managed wolves. And part of the problem with delisting is you have, the delisting rule is not taking into account the fact that the Colville tribe can hunt not just on the res, but on the Northern Territory, which runs longitudinally equivalent to the reservation border, but also north to the Canadian border. So there's a northern section where they can hunt as well.
But I believe the tribe did report that by their count they had 30 some odd wolves at the end of last year, but they're not considered part of the state population.
The state is not. The WDFW did not conclude them in their population count. And my understanding, and we might have different information, is that the Colville tribe did not do a census.
Okay, fair enough. So in terms of what this actually means in a real-world policy impact, without federal protection, lethal removal, whether it's a policy or a rule or whatever, is on the table if in Western Washington, where they've had federal protection, once this rule is lifted and the potential of hunting, the potential of the state taking management actions that might be harder to take with federal protection is there. Is that the key part of your concern with this plan, or is it a key component of that?
That's one component, yeah. So what we have had state management in the eastern third of the state. We have had wolves lethally removed for livestock, for the livestock industry almost every year that we've had this problem, and it's due to public lands grazing. That's truly the impetus. There are some predations that take place on private land, but mostly it's public land. Within Washington, watching the state management move west, we have only had one pack established west of the Cascade Crest, the Diabsid Creek pack, and it's a question whether that pack even still exists. So if we're going to truly get migration of wolves from Northeast Washington and British Columbia into the rest of the state, we've got to curb our lethal management and actually start learning how to coexist with these animals. And coexistence isn't killing. You can't go in and repeatedly kill animals and call that coexistence. One of the other things that's impeding influx of wolves into the state of Washington is the fact that they so heavily hunt wolves in Idaho. Delisting wolves in Washington and Oregon could potentially lead to increased recreational hunting in our state. I mean, it's opening that door to recreational hunting in our state, even though we're still state endangered. There's a heavy push in Northeast Washington to actually open up recreational hunting because we have such an established population there. We don't want to see that happening.
Given the rate that we've seen the wolf population grow in Washington over the last 10 or so years, 10, 12 years, do you think that within 5 years, which I believe with the rule change comes 5 years of federal oversight to ensure policies are working, that's at least the stated goal, Do you think that if wolves have not spread further west, have not spread into further north into the North Cascades, further into the Olympic Peninsula, into southwest Washington, will that be a sign that federal protections were needed from your perspective?
Well, we're not getting that expansion with federal protections. So, you know, that 5-year period that you're referring to, there's actually a paper that came out recently that suggested that because we don't have influx of wolves into Washington from Idaho anymore, from the northern Rocky Mountain population segment, that recovery in Washington could take potentially over 50 years. We're talking about getting wolves into the southwest part of the state and northwestern Oregon. This isn't going to happen if wolves don't have protections. It's just simply not going to happen. I mean, we can use other states as references if you want. I mean, the northern Rocky Mountain wolves were delisted in 2011. Again, politically, not scientifically. And since then, states have decimated populations. A single hunter can take 15 wolves hunting in Idaho and 15 wolves trapping. I mean, that's an individual can take 30 wolves. Populations aren't going to survive if they don't have federal protections. And so when you break it down and when you remove the ESA, you're giving the protection to the state. States have borders, wolf populations don't. In order for wolves to recover throughout the northern Rocky Mountains and throughout the Pacific Northwest, we need to have protections that pass state political borders, that bypass those, or we are really not going to get to recovery of wolves in the West.
We've got 2 minutes left. I'd like to cover 2 more issues if we could. So there's a legal challenge of this rule change, and I believe in the past, previous challenges specifically regarding ESA listing for wolves have been successful. So the wolves have been proposed for delisting and have not been delisted at other times, if based on what I researched. Is that your understanding, and does that make you optimistic if so?
That is my understanding. That is what history has shown us. What makes me optimistic is knowing that the science is on our side. This is a politically motivated move by the Trump administration. It's not a coincidence that when it was announced, you know, and truly, like I said, you know, I mean, I do believe the science is going to support the suit that we're going to be a part of, the litigation we're a part of, and there's multiple suits that are going on throughout the country. All the peer reviewers that looked at this noted that it was not based in the best available science. So we have high confidence that our litigation is going to overturn the delisting proposal.
So at the state level, though, this has been an issue obviously very contentious here in Washington for some time. But at its core, there is sort of a conflict between people that, you know, or the idea that wolves, a wildlife, a native species which once roamed all over the state, or at least in wide parts of it, and is now the species now making a recovery, should not be killed to protect privately owned livestock, which from the other point of view are, you know, part of a way of life. They're someone's livelihood, and they feel they should rightfully be protected. Do you think that the policies we have in place are, that the conflict at its core has to do with that tension? And if so, how will we ever get over it?
So I think what I'm hearing you ask is there a cultural divide that's sort of propagating the problem of wolf recovery? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the way we get past it, and it's something that we're actively working on, is how do we coexist? How do we, you know, as someone who's trying to, or as an entity that's trying to, you know, promote wolf recovery because we see the benefit provided to ecosystems and biodiversity, how do we help and support people whose livelihood is impacted? And I think we have to come together and figure that out as a group. We need to learn how to coexist with wildlife on the landscape. You know, I'll use the Montana. The Tom Miner Basin is a great example of how this can be done. I mean, ranchers have to have buy-in, conservationists have to have buy-in, state agencies have to have buy-in and work together. That's the crux.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Again, Chris Bachman, Wildlife Program Director for the Lands Council, thank you for sharing your perspective and your time.
Appreciate being here. Thank you.
Well, the results haven't been certified yet, but we've got an update on some of the legislative races we reviewed last week. One of the state level races we told you about the day after the election is now going the other way. In the 17th district race in southwest Washington, Republican incumbent Vicki Kraft is now leading her Democratic challenger Tanisha Harris in the race for a seat in the state House of Representatives. Harris had an early lead at the time. Kraft has since pulled ahead by about 1,800 votes at press time. And in the 10th District Senate race, incumbent Republican Ron Mazzal is now leading his Democratic challenger, Helen Price Johnson. Price Johnson was leading the day after the election. It appears more than half of state voters rejected a ballot measure which would have allowed the state to invest funding for the long-term care trust in stocks and bonds, similar to how the state invests pension and retirement plan funding. That's a wrap for this week's episode. We'll be back next week with more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. Until then, have a great week.